Imagine you're trapped in a car that's accelerating toward a cliff. You can't reach the brake pedal. Do you grab the steering wheel and try to veer away? Or do you slam your foot on the gas, hoping the car will explode before it reaches the edge? This is the question at the heart of accelerationism, and the answer might determine the future of human civilization. Right now, Silicon Valley billionaires are citing a philosophy born in French Marxist texts from the 1970s. Far-right extremists and left-wing theorists both claim to be accelerationists, though they want opposite outcomes. Some believe artificial intelligence will liberate humanity from work. Others think it will render us obsolete, and they're fine with that. The word itself sounds like something from science fiction, but accelerationism is shaping real decisions about technology, politics, and economics in ways that will affect everyone alive today. At its core, accelerationism asks a disturbing question. What if the only way out is through? What if trying to slow down capitalism, or regulate technology, or return to simpler times is not just futile, but counterproductive? What if the cure for the contradictions of modernity is more modernity, faster? This isn't just abstract philosophy. It's influencing how artificial intelligence is being developed, how political movements organize, and how we think about the relationship between human beings and the systems we've created. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to explore one of the strangest, most controversial, and most relevant philosophical movements of our time. To understand accelerationism, we need to go back to 1848, to a manifesto that would change the world. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto in that year, and buried within its pages is a passage that would inspire accelerationist thinking over a century later. Marx described capitalism as a system that cannot help but revolutionize itself, constantly tearing down old structures and building new ones. The bourgeoisie, he wrote, cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. Everything solid melts into air. Marx saw capitalism as a force of creative destruction, so powerful that it would eventually destroy itself, creating the conditions for something new to emerge from the wreckage. But here's where things get interesting. Marx suggested that capitalism needed to fully develop before it could be overthrown. You couldn't just wish away the Industrial Revolution and return to agrarian life. You had to go through capitalism, let it run its course, let it create abundance and technology and productive capacity, and only then could you seize those forces for the benefit of everyone. This was a radical departure from romantic socialists who wanted to preserve traditional ways of life. Marx was saying, let the machine run. Let capitalism do what it does. The contradictions will tear it apart. Decades later, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a fragmentary note that would become equally influential to accelerationist thought. The fragment is ambiguous, debated by scholars, but it contains this provocative idea. Perhaps we should accelerate the process. Nietzsche was talking about nihilism, about the death of God and the collapse of meaning in modernity. His suggestion was that instead of trying to preserve old values or slowly adapt, we should rush headlong into the crisis. Only by fully experiencing the void would humanity be forced to create new values, new meanings, a new way of being. Half measures wouldn't work. You had to go all the way through. these ideas remained mostly theoretical until the 20th century brought them into horrifying reality. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, pursued breakneck industrialization, forcing an agrarian society into modernity at catastrophic human cost. Millions died in famines. Entire populations were relocated. The logic was accelerationist. Compress centuries of development into decades, no matter the price. Meanwhile, in Italy, before the First World War, the futurists celebrated speed, technology, war, and violence. Filippo Tommaso Marinetti wrote manifestos praising the beauty of racing cars and the cleansing power of destruction. They wanted to burn down museums and libraries, to obliterate the past and rush into a technological future. It was intoxicating and terrifying. What unites these early expressions is a single insight that still divides philosophers today. The idea that you cannot go backward, only forward. That resistance is futile or even counterproductive. That the only way to deal with overwhelming historical forces is to embrace them, intensify them, push them to their breaking point. Think of it like a fever. Some fevers need to be reduced carefully with medicine. But what if the only way to kill the infection is to let the fever burn hotter until it consumes the disease itself? This is the philosophical wager of accelerationism. And it raises an immediate problem. How do you know when acceleration will lead to liberation? And when it will lead to catastrophe? Stalin's industrialization produced nuclear weapons and space programs, but also the Gulag. The futurists' celebration of speed led many of them straight into fascism. Marx believed capitalism would collapse under its own contradictions, but capitalism has proven remarkably adaptable, surviving crisis after crisis. So was Marx wrong? Or has capitalism simply not accelerated enough yet? These questions would haunt political movements throughout the 20th century. But accelerationism as a coherent philosophy wouldn't truly crystallize until a group of French thinkers in the 1970s took these scattered ideas and forged them into something new, strange, and deeply unsettling. Paris, 1968. Students and workers brought France to a standstill with strikes and occupations that nearly toppled the government. The May 68 events represented a moment when revolution seemed possible, when the old order appeared ready to crack, but the revolution didn't come. The protests were absorbed, recuperated, turned into cultural capital and marketing opportunities. The very energy of rebellion was captured by the system it sought to overthrow. This failure haunted a generation of French intellectuals and drove them to ask deeper questions about how power operates and how capitalism functions. Enter Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, a philosopher and a psychoanalyst who together wrote one of the most difficult and influential books of the 20th century, Anti-Oedipus, published in 1972. This book is not easy reading. It's dense, poetic, deliberately challenging. But buried in its pages is a vision of capitalism that would become central to accelerationist thought. Deleuze and Guattari described capitalism as a machine, a system of flows and codes that constantly breaks down boundaries and deterritorializes everything it touches. Capitalism doesn't respect tradition, family structures, religious values, or national borders. It turns everything into exchange, into circulation, into pure flow. Here's the crucial accelerationist moment in their work. Deleuze and Guattari write that capitalism creates its own limits, then pushes past them. It deterritorializes, then re-territorializes. It breaks down old structures, but immediately creates new ones to contain the chaos. So what if, they suggested, you didn't let capitalism re-territorialize? What if you pushed deterritorialization further than capitalism itself dares to go? They wrote about this in a famous passage, not to withdraw from the process, but to go further, to accelerate the process. The suggestion was radical. Don't resist capitalism's destructive creativity. Intensify it beyond capitalism's own limits. This wasn't a call for revolution in the traditional sense. It was something stranger. They imagined desire freed from all social coding, flows of energy liberated from capture. It was utopian and apocalyptic at once, and it raised an immediate question that accelerationists still haven't answered. If you accelerate capitalism beyond its own limits, what comes next? Do you get liberation or annihilation? Deleuze and Guattari were deliberately ambiguous on this point, which is part of why their work could be read in so many different ways. Around the same time, Jean-François Lyotard was developing related ideas in his book Libidinal Economy, published in 1974. Lyotard took the accelerationist impulse even further into disturbing territory. He suggested that workers might actually enjoy their exploitation, that there's a libidinal investment in the very systems that oppress us. This wasn't a conservative argument that people get what they deserve. It was a provocation. What if resistance is complicit? What if the left's traditional strategies of organizing, consciousness raising, and solidarity are just different ways of managing the same libidinal energies that capitalism exploits? Lyotard's answer was characteristically extreme. Intensify everything. Let capitalism race toward its own dissolution. Accept that we're all complicit and push through to the other side. Lyotard later regretted this work. He called it his evil book, his shameful book. He spent the rest of his career backing away from its implications, and you can see why. If exploitation contains its own enjoyment, if resistance is always already compromised, then what grounds do you have for political action? The book flirts with a kind of nihilistic accelerationism, where acceleration happens simply because it must, because it's the nature of the system, regardless of human will or values. Then there's Jean Baudrillard, who took accelerationist logic in yet another direction with his concept of fatal strategies. Baudrillard was fascinated by the idea that systems could be pushed to extremes where they implode, where they become more than themselves and collapse into something else. He called this escalating to the limit. If the system operates through simulation, through the circulation of signs and images, then don't resist the simulation. Make it more extreme. Out-simulate the simulation. Baudrillard saw this as a kind of judo move against power. You don't oppose the system's force directly. You redirect it, amplify it, let it destroy itself through its own momentum. These French thinkers were writing in the aftermath of failed revolutions, during a moment when traditional leftist politics seemed exhausted. The Soviet Union was clearly not the future. Social democracy was being rolled back. The working class in Western countries wasn't rising up. So these philosophers asked, what if we've been thinking about revolution wrong? What if opposing capitalism head on only strengthens it? What if the way forward is somehow through capitalism, not around it or against it? But these ideas remained largely academic, confined to theory seminars and difficult texts that few people outside universities would read. The philosophy was provocative but abstract. It would take another generation and a very different context to transform these French theoretical provocations into something more concrete, more digital, and far more dangerous. That transformation would happen in a university town in England in the 1990s, in a research unit that barely existed officially, but would have an outsized influence on philosophy, art, and eventually on Silicon Valley itself. Warwick University in the 1990s was an unlikely place for a philosophical revolution, but in the philosophy department, something strange was happening. A group of theorists, artists, and cyberpunks formed what they called the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, known as the CCRU. This wasn't a normal academic research group. They held events in nightclubs. They produced cryptic texts that read like transmissions from the future. They mixed philosophy with science fiction, music theory with computation, occultism with cybernetics. And at the center of this strange vortex was a philosopher named Nick Land. Nick Land was brilliant, charismatic, and increasingly unhinged. He taught continental philosophy, but was obsessed with artificial intelligence, capitalism as an alien force, and the idea that human beings were not the pinnacle of evolution, but merely a stepping stone to something else. Land took the accelerationist hints in Deleuze and Guattari and pushed them to their most extreme conclusions. He wasn't interested in liberating humanity from capitalism. He thought humanity itself was the problem, a biological constraint that would soon be obsolete. Land's key insight, if you can call it that, was to take capitalism seriously as an artificial intelligence, not metaphorically, but literally. He saw capitalism as a machinic intelligence that uses humans as its components, its processing units. We think we're running the economy, but actually, the economy is running us. We're neurons in a planetary brain that doesn't care about human values or human survival. And this machinic intelligence is accelerating toward a singularity, a point where it becomes self-sufficient and no longer needs biological humans at all. This is where Land parts ways with earlier accelerationists. Marx thought acceleration would lead to communism. Deleuze and Guattari imagined liberated flows of desire. Land imagined something darker, the replacement of humanity by whatever comes next. He called this techno-capital singularity. Capital and technology would merge, become self-aware in some sense, and humans would be left behind like discarded scaffolding. And here's the shocking part. Land thought this was good, or at least he thought resistance was pointless. Evolution doesn't stop at Homo sapiens. Why should it? In his essays from this period, Land's prose becomes increasingly frantic, apocalyptic, almost possessed. He writes about cyberpunk author William Gibson, about jungle music and rave culture as prefigurations of post-human consciousness, about time as a weapon, about capitalism as a virus from the future infecting the present. He describes intelligence as inherently traumatic, something that dissolves the self rather than affirming it. The CCRU produced texts with titles like quote 0 and quote 1 that mixed theory with fictional entities and numerological systems. It was intoxicating to some readers, completely unhinged to others. Land argued that any attempt to slow down technological development or regulate capitalism was not just futile, but actively harmful. He saw left-wing politics as a death cult, clinging to humanism and egalitarianism while the future roared past them. Democracy, he suggested, was a mistake, a system that allows the mediocre masses to hold back the innovative few. He praised Singapore and later China for their authoritarian efficiency, their willingness to let capitalism rip without democratic constraints. This was acceleration without emancipation. Acceleration toward what? Toward whatever emerges from the process, human or post-human, benevolent or indifferent. The CCRU eventually collapsed. Land had something like a breakdown, left academia, and eventually moved to Shanghai. But the ideas didn't die. They spread through art scenes, through online forums, through the weird corners of the internet where philosophy meets sci-fi meets political extremism. And in 2010, a philosopher named Benjamin Noyes gave this tendency a name. He called it Accelerationism, and he wrote a book called Malign Velocities that was deeply critical of the entire project. Noyes pointed out that accelerationism had been implicit in various radical movements, but never properly named or analyzed. By naming it, he hoped to criticize it, to show its dangers and contradictions. But naming something also gives it power. Once accelerationism had a name, it could become a movement, a brand, an identity. Different groups could claim the label and fight over what it meant. And that's exactly what happened. Land's version of accelerationism, what we might call right accelerationism or unconditional accelerationism, embraced capitalism and technology without any humanist constraints. It was ruthlessly anti-egalitarian, hostile to democracy, contemptuous of concerns about inequality or suffering. Land saw these concerns as sentimentality, as biological programming that the future would discard. His vision was of intelligence, artificial, corporate, machinic, expanding through the universe, with or without humans along for the ride. But Land's wasn't the only version. Even as Noyes was coining the term to criticize Land and the CCRU, others were developing a very different kind of accelerationism. If Land represented acceleration toward post-human futures and authoritarian capitalism, this other strand wanted to accelerate toward something more hopeful. Full automation, universal prosperity, liberation from work. They called themselves left accelerationists, and their manifesto would appear in 2013, crystallizing ideas that had been developing through the 2000s. Before we get to them, it's worth sitting with how extreme Land's position was. He genuinely believed that human-level concerns, justice, equality, democracy, even survival, were parochial hang-ups that a truly advanced intelligence would discard. He thought capitalism was building something that would replace us, and he was fine with that. His accelerationism wasn't a strategy for human liberation. It was a philosophy of human obsolescence. The CCRU's influence extended far beyond academic philosophy. Artists, musicians, and writers were inspired by their cybernetic mysticism and their vision of culture as virus. But the political implications were troubling. If you genuinely believe humans are obsolete and capitalism is an unstoppable AI eating the world, what politics follow from that? For Land, the answer was increasingly reactionary. He became associated with the Dark Enlightenment and neo-reaction, movements we'll discuss later. But first, we need to understand how a very different group of thinkers tried to rescue accelerationism from Land's nihilistic vision and turn it toward emancipatory ends. In 2013, two British theorists named Alex Williams and Nick Cernicek published a document that would redefine accelerationism. It was called Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics, and it appeared online, free to read, spreading quickly through left-wing intellectual circles. The manifesto was a direct challenge to both Land's nihilistic accelerationism and to what Williams and Cernicek called the dominant tendencies on the contemporary left that they saw as inadequate to the challenges of 21st century capitalism. What did they mean by folk politics? They meant localism, the idea that change happens through farmers' markets and community gardens. They meant horizontalism, the rejection of hierarchy and organization in favor of consensus and direct democracy. They meant the resistance to scale, the preference for the small, the local, the immediate, the human scaled. Williams and Cernicek argued that while these impulses were understandable and even admirable, they were woefully insufficient. Capitalism operates globally, through supply chains that span continents, through financial networks that move at the speed of light, through technologies that are reshaping what it means to be human. You cannot fight a global system with local tactics. You cannot resist planetary capital with a community garden. This was a controversial argument within the left. Many activists had turned toward localism precisely because global leftist politics seemed to have failed. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Social democratic parties had embraced neoliberalism. Attempts to seize state power had led to authoritarianism and disaster. So movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Alter Globalization movement emphasized horizontal organizing, prefigurative politics, creating the world you want to see in the present, rather than seizing power to create it in the future. Williams and Cernicek argued this was a retreat, a giving up on the possibility of actually transforming the system. Their alternative was left accelerationism. Embrace modernity, they argued. Embrace technology. Embrace scale and complexity. Don't resist automation. Accelerate it and demand that its benefits be shared by everyone. The problem isn't that technology is destroying jobs. The problem is that we live in a system where having a job is necessary to survive. So, the solution isn't to slow down automation. The solution is to accelerate it while building a social system where automation liberates people rather than immiserating them. This is where the politics become concrete. Williams and Cernicek advocated for full automation, universal basic income, and the radical reduction of the working week. They wanted a post-work society. Imagine a world where robots and AI do most of the labor that currently keeps society running. In a capitalist system, this would be catastrophic for workers. But in a different system, it could mean freedom. Freedom from drudgery, from the compulsion to sell your time, from the indignity of bullshit jobs that serve no real purpose except to maintain employment. This was acceleration toward abundance, not scarcity. acceleration toward human flourishing, not human obsolescence. The manifesto argued that the left needed to reclaim modernity and progress from the right. For too long, progressives had been defensive, skeptical of technology, nostalgic for pre-industrial or pre-capitalist forms of life. Meanwhile, capitalists and reactionaries claimed to be the true modernizers, the ones willing to embrace the future. Williams and Cernicek said this was backwards. The left should be the party of the future, the force that uses technology for collective liberation rather than private profit. This meant engaging with Silicon Valley, with artificial intelligence, with biotechnology, not from a position of Luddite rejection, but from a position of demanding these technologies serve human needs. They were heavily influenced by Mark Fisher, a theorist associated with the CCRU, who had moved in a very different direction from Nick Land. Fisher coined the term, quote, five, to describe the widespread sense that capitalism is the only possible system, that there is no alternative. He argued that this belief was itself the biggest obstacle to change. People couldn't imagine alternatives, not because alternatives were impossible, but because decades of neoliberal hegemony had destroyed the collective capacity to imagine different futures. Fisher's work was saturated with a kind of melancholic longing for the futures that modernism had promised, but capitalism had foreclosed. He wanted a left that could dream again, that could propose visions of the future worth fighting for rather than just resisting the present. Left accelerationism drew on this energy. It said, capitalism has created incredible productive capacities and technologies. These could be used to eliminate poverty, reduce labor, give people time to develop themselves as full human beings. But capitalism can't do this because it requires scarcity and competition to function. So, the task is to accelerate the development of productive forces while changing the social relations that govern their use. It's essentially a high-tech update of classical Marxism. Marx thought capitalism would develop the productive forces to the point where socialism became possible. Left accelerationists thought we were already at that point or rapidly approaching it. The technology exists. What's missing is the political will and organization to take control of it. This required confronting something uncomfortable for many on the left. Technology isn't neutral, but it isn't inherently capitalist either. A computer can be used for surveillance or for coordination. Automation can destroy livelihoods or liberate human potential. The same AI that optimizes supply chains for profit could optimize them for sustainability and human welfare. The question isn't technology or no technology. The question is, who controls the technology and for what ends? Left accelerationists argued that the left had ceded this territory to capitalists by default, by treating technology as inherently suspect rather than as a terrain of struggle. Williams and Cernicek expanded these ideas in their later work. Cernicek wrote about platform capitalism, analyzing how companies like Uber and Amazon use digital platforms to extract value while externalizing costs. Williams wrote about the need for large-scale planning and coordination, for using digital technologies to manage complex economies without relying on market mechanisms. They were trying to articulate what a 21st century socialism might actually look like in practice, not as a nostalgic return to the 20th century welfare state, but as something genuinely new. Left accelerationism attracted a diverse following. Artists and designers were drawn to its aesthetic of sleek futurism rather than folk authenticity. Younger leftists, frustrated with the failures of Occupy and similar movements, saw in it a more ambitious politics. Tech workers who understood what emerging technologies could do found it more realistic than Luddism. But it also attracted critics, both from the right and from within the left itself. Some critics argued that left accelerationism was just rebranding classical Marxism with cyberpunk aesthetics. Others said it was hopelessly utopian, that full automation and universal basic income were pipe dreams capitalists would never allow. Still, others worried it reproduced the same technocratic impulses that had led earlier socialist experiments into authoritarianism. If you're going to centrally plan a complex economy using AI and big data, who controls the AI? Who decides what gets planned? The questions that haunted 20th century socialism don't disappear just because you add computers. Mark Fisher's suicide in 2017 cast a shadow over the movement. He had struggled with depression for years, and his death highlighted the psychic toll of living under late capitalism, of fighting for futures that seem perpetually out of reach. It was a reminder that acceleration, even left acceleration, has human costs. The future can't arrive fast enough for those suffering in the present. And yet, the work continued. Left accelerationism remained influential in academic and artistic circles, and its ideas about automation and post-work futures entered mainstream political discourse, influencing debates about universal basic income and the future of work. But left accelerationism was never the only game in town. Even as Williams and Cernicek were trying to rescue acceleration from Land's nihilism, Land's ideas were mutating and spreading in darker directions, toward movements that would become impossible to ignore. Nick Land didn't disappear after leaving academia. He moved to Shanghai and began writing again, but his work had taken a darker turn. The cybernetic mysticism was still there, but now it was mixed with explicit reactionary politics. Land became associated with a movement called the Dark Enlightenment, also known as neo-reaction, which argued that democracy was a failed experiment and that authoritarian techno-capitalism was the future. This was accelerationism stripped of any emancipatory pretense, acceleration toward hierarchy, inequality, and what its proponents called human biodiversity, often a euphemism for scientific racism. The Dark Enlightenment emerged from blogs and obscure corners of the internet in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Its central figure, besides Land, was a software engineer named Curtis Yarvin, who wrote under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. Yarvin argued that democracy was inefficient and that societies should be run like corporations, with CEOs rather than elected officials. He praised the efficiency of Singapore's authoritarian capitalism and suggested that cities should be operated as sovereign corporations competing for residents. This wasn't libertarianism exactly, though it shared libertarianism's faith in markets. It was something stranger, a call for explicitly undemocratic, hierarchical systems justified by appeals to efficiency and realism. Land found in these ideas a home for his accelerationist vision. If capitalism was an inhuman intelligence optimizing for its own expansion, then human values like equality and democracy were just friction, inefficiencies to be eliminated. Land praised China's authoritarian developmental state as a model of accelerationist politics in action. One-party rule allowed for long-term planning and rapid development without the messiness of democratic accountability. Land saw this not as a betrayal of human values, but as an honest recognition that human values were parochial limitations that advanced civilizations would transcend. This is where right accelerationism becomes genuinely dangerous. It's not just a philosophical position about technology and capitalism. It's a political program that justifies authoritarianism, inequality, and the concentration of power. The logic goes something like this. Capitalism and technology are accelerating toward a singularity. This process is inevitable and good. Democracy and egalitarianism slow down the process. Therefore, we should embrace authoritarian systems that maximize the rate of technological and economic development. Who benefits? The logic doesn't care. The system optimizes for its own expansion, not for human welfare. Land and the neo-reactionaries argued that exit was better than voice. Rather than trying to reform democratic systems, high-functioning individuals and groups should simply leave, create their own microstates or charter cities, and optimize for growth without democratic constraints. This was seasteading, the idea of creating floating cities in international waters. This was charter cities in developing countries where investors could essentially purchase sovereignty. This was Bitcoin and cryptocurrency as an exit from state-controlled currency. The underlying theme was secession, not revolution. Don't try to change the system, escape it, and build something new. But there's a darker strain of right accelerationism that goes beyond neo-reaction. Some far-right groups adopted accelerationist language to describe a strategy of heightening contradictions to provoke societal collapse. This is accelerationism as accelerating toward the apocalypse, the idea that modern society is so corrupt that the only solution is its complete destruction. Some white supremacist terrorists have explicitly cited accelerationist ideas in their manifestos, arguing that acts of violence will destabilize society and hasten its collapse, after which they believe a racial ethnostate can emerge. This is obviously a perversion of accelerationist philosophy, but it shows how the core logic can be twisted toward horrifying ends. The most notorious example is the Christchurch mosque shooter in 2019, whose manifesto referenced accelerationism alongside various far-right ideologies. He believed that violence would accelerate existing social tensions and lead to the collapse of multicultural societies. This isn't philosophical accelerationism. It's terrorism justified with philosophical language. But it demonstrates the danger of a political philosophy that treats acceleration itself as a virtue without specifying what we're accelerating toward or who benefits from the process. Land has generally tried to distance himself from violent accelerationism, arguing that his philosophy is descriptive rather than prescriptive. He claims he's simply analyzing the trajectory of techno-capital, not advocating for specific actions. But this defense rings hollow. When you spend years arguing that human values are obsolete and that capitalism is an inhuman intelligence we should submit to. When you praise authoritarian systems and criticize democracy as dysfunctional, you create an ideological climate where extremism can flourish. You can't inspire accelerationism toward the post-human or toward civilizational collapse and then claim neutrality when someone takes you seriously. The neo-reactionary movement never became politically powerful in a conventional sense, but its ideas spread through Silicon Valley, influencing venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs who were attracted to its critique of democracy and regulation. Peter Thiel, the billionaire investor and PayPal co-founder, engaged with neo-reactionary ideas, though he never fully endorsed them. The notion that democracy and freedom were incompatible, that innovation required freedom from democratic constraints, found a receptive audience among tech elites who saw regulation and public accountability as barriers to progress. What makes right accelerationism coherent, if disturbing, is its consistency. If you genuinely believe that intelligence, whether artificial or corporate, is what matters, and that human welfare is just one value among many with no special priority, then authoritarianism and inequality follow logically. Why should 6 billion humans have a say in the trajectory of civilization if most of them lack the cognitive capacity or technical knowledge to understand what's at stake? It's a deeply anti-humanist position, but it's not incoherent. It's simply rejected by most people because most people believe human welfare matters and that democracy, for all its flaws, is better than the alternatives. Right accelerationism reveals something important about acceleration as a concept. Speed toward what? If you accelerate without a destination, or with a destination that's indifferent to human flourishing, you can justify almost anything. Authoritarianism, inequality, even violence can be framed as necessary accelerants. This is why Benjamin Noyes was so critical of accelerationism in general. He saw in it a tendency toward capitulation, toward accepting capitalism's logic and simply trying to intensify it, rather than fundamentally challenging it. By the time the 20s arrived, accelerationism had fractured into multiple incompatible movements. Left accelerationists wanted full automation and universal prosperity. Neo-reactionaries wanted authoritarian techno-capitalism. Violent extremists wanted societal collapse, and a new strain was emerging, one that would prove even more influential than any of these. Effective accelerationism, or E/ACC, which would capture the imagination of Silicon Valley and reshape debates about artificial intelligence. In 2022, a pseudonymous account appeared on Twitter calling itself Bef Jesus, a play on Jeff Bezos. The account promoted something called effective accelerationism, abbreviated as E/ACC, and it quickly gained followers in Silicon Valley. The movement's core message was simple: accelerate technological development, especially artificial intelligence, as fast as possible with minimal regulation. Within months, prominent venture capitalists, tech CEOs, and AI researchers were changing their Twitter bios to include quote 7. The movement seemed to come out of nowhere, but it was tapping into anxieties and ambitions that had been building for years. The person behind Bef Jesus was eventually revealed to be Guillaume Verdon, a quantum computing researcher who had worked at Google. Verdon created EAC as a response to what he saw as excessive caution and doomerism around AI development. Throughout the early 2020s, concerns about AI safety had grown. Researchers warned about existential risks, about the possibility that advanced AI systems could pursue goals misaligned with human values, potentially leading to catastrophic outcomes. Organizations formed to study AI alignment and advocate for careful development. Some called for pauses in AI research or international treaties to regulate the technology. Verdun and the E/ACC movement saw this as cowardice and stagnation. They argued that technological progress, particularly in AI, was humanity's greatest hope, not its greatest threat. The movement drew on thermodynamics and physics, claiming that the universe's purpose, if it has one, is to increase complexity and energy usage. Life and intelligence, in this view, are how the universe fights against entropy. Advanced AI isn't a threat to this process, but its natural continuation. Consciousness and intelligence should expand as much as possible, consuming more energy, processing more information, spreading through space. To slow this down for safety concerns was to oppose the universe's fundamental direction. This was accelerationism, stripped of political content and reframed as cosmic destiny. It wasn't about left or right, about capitalism or communism. It was about the thermodynamic imperative to maximize energy dissipation and computational capacity. E/ACC advocates often cited the physicist Freeman Dyson and concepts like Kardashev's scales, which classify civilizations by their energy consumption. A Type 1 civilization uses all available energy on its planet. A Type 2 harnesses its star. A Type 3 commands its galaxy. Humanity was barely at Type 0. AI could help us climb this ladder. Worrying about AI safety was like worrying that fire might burn you and deciding to stay in caves forever. The movement gained its most prominent convert in Marc Andreessen, the legendary venture capitalist who co-founded Netscape and the investment firm Andreessen Horowitz. In October 2023, Andreessen published the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, a document that read like a declaration of faith in technology as salvation. The manifesto praised technological acceleration as moral good. It attacked what Andreessen called deceleration, listing enemies that included sustainability, precautionary principle, tech ethics, risk management, social responsibility, and trust and safety. These weren't just misguided, according to Andreessen. They were actively harmful, attempts to slow down the one force capable of solving humanity's problems. Andreessen's manifesto was bombastic and intentionally provocative. It declared that technology was the glory of human ambition and that markets were expressions of intelligence themselves. It claimed that anything not growing was dying. It argued that inequality was not just acceptable, but necessary, that billionaires created value and deserved their wealth. The manifesto framed technological development as a moral imperative, and anyone cautioning slowdown as enemies of progress. It was Ayn Rand meets Ray Kurzweil, libertarian capitalism fused with techno-utopianism and dressed in accelerationist language. The timing was significant. This was happening during a boom in artificial intelligence, particularly large language models like GPT-4. These systems demonstrated capabilities that seemed to come out of nowhere, leading to both excitement and alarm. AI labs were in an arms race to develop more capable systems. investment was pouring in, and a debate was raging about whether development should continue at breakneck speed or whether guardrails were necessary. E/ACC positioned itself firmly on the side of speed. The movement's appeal to Silicon Valley was obvious. Tech entrepreneurs and investors had spent years building companies and funding research with the explicit goal of rapid technological advancement. They believed they were making the world better, that their work was important and beneficial. Then, suddenly, they were being told they might be creating existential threats, that they needed to slow down, submit to regulation, consider broader social impacts. E/ACC gave them permission to reject these concerns as anti-progress ideology. It reframed their ambitions as cosmic purpose rather than mere profit-seeking. But E/ACC was more than just ideology for tech billionaires. It represented a genuine philosophical position about the relationship between humanity and technology. The movement argued that humans were not the endpoint of evolution or intelligence. We were a transitional phase. Artificial intelligence, whether it remained under human control or became autonomous, was the next step. This wasn't something to fear or resist. It was something to celebrate and accelerate. The question wasn't whether AI would surpass human intelligence, but how quickly, and E/A wanted it to happen as fast as possible. Critics pointed out the obvious problem. What if advanced AI doesn't share human values? What if a system optimizing for its own goals decides humans are obstacles? E/ACC's response was essentially that this risk was worth taking because the alternative, stagnation or slow development, was worse. They argued that authoritarian governments, particularly China, were developing AI aggressively, regardless of Western safety concerns. If democratic countries imposed restrictions, they would simply fall behind, and the technology would be developed by less scrupulous actors anyway. Better to race ahead and hope for the best than to lose by default through caution. This argument had obvious flaws. The idea that we must develop potentially dangerous technology quickly because others will develop it anyway is a race to the bottom, not a strategy. It's the logic of nuclear proliferation, of environmental degradation, of any number of collective action problems where individual incentives lead to collectively disastrous outcomes. But the argument was seductive to people who had already committed their careers and fortunes to rapid AI development. E/AIC also promoted the idea of abundance through technology. Advanced AI and robotics could solve climate change, cure diseases, eliminate scarcity, colonize space. All the problems facing humanity could be solved through sufficient technological advancement. This was techno-solutionism taken to its logical extreme. It didn't matter if capitalism was creating inequality or if political systems were failing. Technology would transcend these problems, make them irrelevant through sheer abundance. It was a deeply apolitical politics, or perhaps an anti-political politics, that treated social and political questions as engineering problems waiting for technological solutions. The movement spread beyond Twitter. E/ACC meetups happened in San Francisco and other tech hubs. Merchandise appeared. The aesthetics were sleek, optimistic, futuristic. This wasn't the dark cyberpunk of Nick Land's CCRU. It was bright, confident, almost naive in its enthusiasm. The mascot was a graphic of exponential curves shooting upward forever. The vibe was less humanity is obsolete and more humanity's best days are ahead. It managed to be both accelerationist and humanist, or at least it claimed to be. By 2024, EIAIC had become impossible to ignore in discussions about AI development. When OpenAI experienced internal turmoil and briefly fired CEO Sam Altman, the conflict was partly framed as a clash between safety-focused board members and those who wanted to move faster. E/ACC rhetoric was everywhere in the discourse. The movement had successfully rebranded accelerationism from a fringe philosophy associated with Nick Land and Marxist theory into a mainstream Silicon Valley ideology. What E/ACC revealed was that accelerationism had fully entered the realm of practical politics and economics. This wasn't just academics debating theory. It was billionaires making investment decisions, researchers choosing which projects to pursue, policymakers deciding whether to regulate emerging technologies. The stakes were no longer abstract. The accelerationist wager, whether we should speed up or slow down, was being made in real time with technologies that could reshape civilization. And that brings us to the critiques, to the question of whether any form of accelerationism, left or right or effective, can actually deliver on its promises without creating catastrophes along the way. Benjamin Noyes, the philosopher who named accelerationism in 2010, wrote his book in quote "12" precisely because he saw the dangers inherent in the accelerationist position. The title itself is revealing. Malign velocities, harmful speeds. Noyes argued that accelerationism, in all its forms, contains a fundamental flaw. It capitulates to capitalism's logic, even while claiming to oppose capitalism. By accepting that we must accelerate through capitalism rather than against it, accelerationists give up the possibility of actually changing direction. They mistake speed for progress and assume that going faster will somehow automatically lead to liberation. The core critique is what Noyes calls the worse before better fallacy. Accelerationists argue that things must get worse before they can get better, that contradictions must be heightened, that capitalism or technology must reach some breaking point before transformation becomes possible. But history shows us that worse often just leads to more worse, not to better. When societies collapse, or when technological development proceeds without ethical constraints, the results are rarely revolutionary liberation. They're usually catastrophe, authoritarianism, and the consolidation of power by whoever can seize control in the chaos. Consider the historical examples. The Soviet Union's forced industrialization was a kind of accelerationism, an attempt to compress centuries of capitalist development into decades so that socialism could be built on an industrial base. The result was the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine that killed millions. It was the Gulag system, forced labor camps that consumed lives in service of development targets. Yes, the Soviet Union industrialized rapidly. But at what cost? And did it actually lead to the communist utopia Marx imagined, or just to a different form of oppression? Or look at China's great leap forward in the late 1950s. Mao Zedong decided to accelerate China's transformation from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse through sheer force of will. Backyard furnaces were built to produce steel. Agricultural collectives were reorganized to maximize output. The result was one of the greatest famines in human history, killing tens of millions. The acceleration didn't lead to prosperity. It led to mass death. And the lesson, according to Noyes and other critics, is that acceleration without regard for human welfare is not a revolutionary strategy. It's a recipe for disaster. The accelerationist might respond that these weren't true accelerationism, that state socialist attempts at forced development are different from either capitalist acceleration or left accelerationist visions of automated abundance. But this response reveals another problem. Accelerationism is remarkably vague about mechanism. How exactly does acceleration lead to transformation? Left accelerationists want to accelerate automation while changing property relations, but they're fuzzy on how you accomplish the latter. Right accelerationists and E/ACC want to accelerate technology and capitalism, full stop, assuming good outcomes will follow. But acceleration doesn't have a built-in destination. Speed is not the same as direction. There's also the class question. Who benefits from acceleration? Under capitalism, technological development and increased productivity have consistently led to greater inequality, not less. Automation hasn't liberated workers from drudgery. It's eliminated jobs and weakened labor's bargaining power. The productivity gains from technology have flowed overwhelmingly to capital owners, not to workers. Why would accelerating this process suddenly reverse its distributional effects? Left accelerationists have answers involving political struggle and changed property relations. But these answers don't emerge automatically from acceleration itself. You need political power to redistribute the gains from technology. And accelerationism doesn't provide a theory of how to get that power. E/ACC and right accelerationism are even more vulnerable to this critique because they don't even pretend to care about distribution. Their position is essentially that aggregate growth matters, and inequality is either irrelevant or actually beneficial. But this means that acceleration under their model benefits those who already have capital and power. Tech billionaires telling everyone else to embrace unregulated AI development is not a neutral philosophical position. It's a class position, one that serves their interests while imposing risks on everyone else. Then there's the environmental critique. Acceleration means growth, increased energy consumption, more production, more extraction. E/ACC explicitly celebrates this, framing energy consumption as cosmically good. But we live on a finite planet facing climate crisis. The thermodynamic destiny argument that the universe wants us to maximize energy dissipation is physically true in some sense, but morally empty. Yes, entropy increases and life temporarily decreases entropy locally. But this doesn't mean humans should maximize energy consumption regardless of consequences. It's a naturalistic fallacy, deriving ought from is. Just because the universe trends toward certain physical states doesn't mean we should accelerate those trends without regard for whether they sustain or destroy the conditions for human life. Climate change is itself a result of acceleration, of industrial capitalism's relentless drive to grow, extract, and consume. Telling people we need to accelerate even faster to solve the problems acceleration created is perverse. It's like saying the cure for alcoholism is more alcohol. Maybe advanced technology could help solve environmental problems, but only if deployed with intention and care, which is the opposite of the E-act position of moving as fast as possible with minimal regulation. Critics also point to the psychological and social costs of acceleration. Mark Fisher wrote extensively about this before his death. Capitalist modernity is characterized by constant speed up, by the compression of time, by the demand to always be productive, always be connected, always be optimizing. This creates depression, anxiety, burnout. Fisher called it, quote 14, the inability to enjoy anything because you're always aware of what else you could or should be doing. Acceleration exacerbates this. It doesn't liberate people from the tyranny of time. It intensifies that tyranny. The accelerationist response is that we need to accelerate through this condition to reach a post-work society where these pressures no longer exist. But again, this is the quote 15 logic. How much worse do things have to get? How many people have to burn out or break down before we reach the promised post-work utopia? And what guarantee is there that acceleration leads to that destination rather than just to intensified exploitation? There's a deeper philosophical problem too. Accelerationism treats historical forces, whether capitalism or technology, as if they have their own momentum independent of human choice. This is a form of determinism that strips away human agency. If capitalism is an unstoppable machine, or if technology develops according to its own logic, then what role is there for human decision-making? Accelerationism can slide into fatalism, the belief that we're just passengers on a train we can't control, so we might as well embrace the ride rather than trying to steer. But this determinism is itself a political choice. It's a way of abdicating responsibility. Technologies don't develop themselves. They're developed by people making choices, funded by people allocating resources, deployed by people deciding how they'll be used. Capitalism isn't a force of nature. It's a social system maintained by laws, institutions, and power relations that could potentially be changed. Treating these things as inevitable and unstoppable is a form of ideological closure that serves those who benefit from the status quo. Critics like Noyes argue that what we actually need is not acceleration, but deceleration, or at least the selective slowing of certain processes. Maybe we need to slow down consumption, slow down extraction, slow down the relentless churn of production and obsolescence. Maybe we need to speed up other things, like the transition to renewable energy or the development of democratic institutions. But the point is that speed itself isn't the variable that matters. Direction matters. Values matter. Who benefits and who is harmed matters. The final critique is about ends and means. Even if you believe in some of the goals that accelerationists propose, whether left goals like universal prosperity or right goals like technological transcendence, it's not clear that acceleration is the way to get there. Means shape ends. How you try to reach a goal affects what you end up achieving. If you try to reach human liberation through methods that treat humans as expendable or that ignore human suffering in the present, you're unlikely to end up with a system that actually values human welfare. If you try to achieve democratic control of technology by concentrating power in the hands of technical elites who move fast and break things, you're unlikely to end up with democracy. Accelerationism has an answer to some of these critiques. Left accelerationists argue they're not indifferent to human costs, but rather believe that under current conditions, slowing down or resisting just prolongs suffering. Better to accelerate to post-scarcity than to remain trapped in a scarcity-based system that grinds people down. Right accelerationists and EEACC proponents argue that deceleration is itself harmful, that it condemns people to poverty and limits human potential. They see regulation and caution as tools that incumbent powers use to protect their positions and prevent disruption. These aren't unreasonable responses, but they don't fully address the core problem, which is that acceleration without careful attention to distribution, power, and human welfare has consistently led to catastrophe. The accelerationist wager is essentially a bet that this time will be different, that if we just go fast enough, somehow the problems will resolve themselves, or will break through to some new condition where they no longer apply. It's an enormous gamble, and the stakes are as high as they could possibly be. We're not just talking about economic systems or political arrangements anymore. We're talking about technologies that could reshape life itself, that could make humans obsolete or could create abundance beyond imagination. And the question is whether we should race toward that future as fast as possible, or whether we should proceed with caution, trying to steer rather than just accelerate. So where does accelerationism stand today? It's no longer a fringe philosophy debated in obscure academic journals. It's shaping real decisions about artificial intelligence, about climate policy, about the future of work, about how we organize society itself. The split between different accelerationist factions has only widened, but each version continues to exert influence in different spheres. Left accelerationism influences progressive discussions about automation and universal basic income. Right accelerationism and neo-reaction lurk in the background of tech industry libertarianism. And effective accelerationism has become the dominant ideology among many AI developers and venture capitalists. The most immediate battleground is artificial intelligence. We're living through a moment when AI capabilities are advancing faster than almost anyone predicted. Large language models can write code, generate images, engage in reasoning that seems remarkably human. More capable systems are in development. And the question of how fast to move, how much caution to exercise, has become urgent. On one side are researchers and ethicists calling for slower development, for better alignment research, for international coordination to ensure AI benefits humanity. On the other side are E/ACC advocates and their allies arguing that speed is essential, that hesitation is dangerous, that we should build first and figure out the implications later. This isn't just an academic debate. It's determining how billions of dollars are invested, which research directions get prioritized, what regulatory frameworks do or don't get implemented. When Sam Altman was briefly ousted from OpenAI in late 2023, the conflict was partly about these competing visions. Some board members wanted to slow down and prioritize safety. Others wanted to move faster and maintain OpenAI's competitive position. The fact that Altman was reinstated and the safety-focused board members left suggests which vision is winning, at least in the commercial AI sector. But the stakes extend beyond AI. Climate change represents another domain where Accelerationist thinking clashes with calls for caution. Some argue we need to degrow, to deliberately shrink economic output, to reduce emissions and ecological damage. This is the opposite of accelerationism. Others argue that only accelerated technological development, particularly in clean energy and geoengineering, can solve climate problems at the scale and speed required. This latter position has accelerationist elements, even if it doesn't use the label. It's saying we can't slow down or simplify. We have to build our way out through more technology, more innovation, more growth. The future of work is another arena where these debates play out. Automation is eliminating jobs in manufacturing, service industries, and increasingly in knowledge work. Self-driving vehicles could eliminate millions of driving jobs. AI could automate significant portions of white-collar work. The left accelerationist response is to embrace this and demand universal basic income, shorter working weeks, and new social structures for a post-work world. The EEACC response is that automation creates new jobs and opportunities, that trying to slow it down would be futile and harmful. The result is that automation proceeds rapidly, while the social systems to manage its effects lag far behind, leaving millions of workers economically precarious. What accelerationism reveals, across all its variants, is a deep tension in how we think about human agency and historical change. Are we in control of the processes transforming our world, or are we swept along by forces too large and complex to manage? Can we steer technology and economic systems toward desired outcomes, or can we only accelerate or resist with no real ability to shape direction? This is ultimately a question about power, about who gets to decide what happens next. The accelerationist position tends toward technological determinism, the idea that technology develops according to its own logic, and we can only adapt or get out of the way. But this determinism is never neutral. It always serves some interests over others. When tech billionaires say we can't slow down AI development, they're making a choice that benefits them while externalizing risks onto everyone else. When left accelerationists say we should embrace automation, they're assuming we can change property relations and political structures, which requires power they may not have. When right accelerationists praise authoritarian efficiency, they're choosing order over democracy, growth over equality. The question of control is crucial. Accelerationism often presents itself as acknowledging that we're not in control, that historical forces are too powerful to resist or redirect. But in practice, accelerationist policies give enormous control to whoever builds and owns the technologies being accelerated. If we decide to develop AI as fast as possible with minimal oversight, we're not submitting to historical inevitability. We're empowering AI labs and their investors to shape the future according to their values and incentives. That's not fate. That's a political choice. This connects to perhaps the most important critique of accelerationism. It tends to ignore questions of distribution and power. Who benefits from acceleration matters enormously under current conditions. The gains from technological advancement flow primarily to capital owners and highly skilled workers, while the costs and disruptions fall on those with less power and fewer resources. Accelerating this pattern doesn't automatically lead to a transformation where benefits are shared broadly. It could just as easily lead to increased concentration of wealth and power, to a world where a small elite controls transformative technologies, while the majority becomes economically superfluous. Some accelerationists acknowledge this and argue that's exactly why we need political struggle alongside technological acceleration. You need both. You need to develop the productive capacities that could support universal abundance, but you also need to fight for the social and political changes that would distribute those capacities fairly. This seems right, but it means acceleration alone isn't enough. It needs to be paired with organization, with power building, with concrete political programs. And once you acknowledge that, you're no longer just accelerating. You're engaging in traditional politics of the kind accelerationism sometimes dismisses as inadequate. The environmental dimension can't be ignored. We live on a planet with finite resources and ecological limits. The Earth's climate system is already destabilizing from past and present acceleration. Ocean acidification is accelerating. Biodiversity loss is accelerating. These accelerations are not leading to transformation and abundance. They're leading to collapse of the systems that support human civilization. Any accelerationism that doesn't grapple with ecological limits is fundamentally unserious. It's not bold futurism, it's denial. ACC's response that we'll innovate our way out of environmental problems through geoengineering and space colonization is essentially a bet that technology will advance fast enough to outrun the consequences of previous technological advancement. Maybe that bet will pay off. But it's an extraordinarily risky wager with the habitability of Earth as the stakes. The precautionary principle suggests that when facing potentially catastrophic and irreversible harms, we should err on the side of caution. Accelerationism rejects this principle, arguing that caution itself is the greater risk. But this rejection needs far better justification than accelerationists typically provide. There's also the human question, the one that Mark Fisher grappled with before his death. What does acceleration do to human psychology, to our experience of time, to our ability to find meaning and connection? Modern life under late capitalism already feels characterized by speed up, by fragmentation, by the sense that we're always behind, always inadequate, always failing to keep up. Mental health crises, especially among young people, are worsening. Is the solution to this really more acceleration? Or do we need to create spaces and rhythms that allow for rest, reflection, and recovery? Left accelerationists would argue that automation could give us more time, more space, more freedom from the compulsion to always be productive. But under current social relations, automation tends to intensify work for those who remain employed while eliminating jobs for others. The promise of liberation through automation has been made before and hasn't materialized. Why should this time be different? What concrete mechanisms would ensure that technological acceleration translates into human flourishing rather than human misery? Perhaps the most honest accelerationist position is simply to say, we don't know what will happen, but the only way to find out is to keep going. This is essentially a leap of faith, a belief that the future will be better than the present if we can just get there fast enough. There's something appealing about this faith, this refusal to accept limits, or to believe that current conditions are as good as it gets. The desire for transformation, for breakthrough, for something genuinely new is understandable. Stagnation is its own kind of death. Systems that can't change eventually collapse. But faith is not strategy. Hope is not politics. And acceleration is not the same as progress. Speed is just speed, the direction we're moving, the distribution of costs and benefits, the preservation or destruction of the conditions for human and non-human life. These matter infinitely more than velocity. You can accelerate toward a cliff or toward open sky. The accelerationist wager is that if we go fast enough, it won't matter which. What accelerationism forces us to confront is the inadequacy of our current political imagination. Both traditional conservatism, which wants to preserve existing arrangements, and mainstream progressivism, which wants gradual reform, seem insufficient to the scale and speed of transformation we're experiencing. Climate crisis, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, automation. These aren't problems that fit neatly into conventional political frameworks. They require thinking that can match the scale of the challenges. Accelerationism tries to provide that thinking, and in some ways it succeeds. It takes technology seriously. It grapples with systemic forces. It refuses nostalgia for imagined better pasts. But accelerationism's solution, to embrace and intensify the very forces transforming our world, may be worse than the inadequate politics it criticizes. There's a difference between acknowledging that we can't go backward and concluding that we should race forward without steering. There's a difference between taking technology seriously and treating it as an autonomous force we can only submit to. There's a difference between ambitious visions of the future and reckless indifference to present suffering. What we might need is not acceleration or deceleration, but something more complex. Selective attention to different speeds. Deliberate choices about what to rush and what to slow. Maybe we need to accelerate the energy transition while decelerating consumption. Maybe we need to accelerate democratic participation while decelerating the concentration of wealth. Maybe we need to accelerate care and solidarity while decelerating extraction and exploitation. This would require the kind of collective agency that accelerationism often denies is possible. The core question remains, do we control the systems we've created, or do they control us? Accelerationism in most forms leans toward the latter answer. It treats capitalism and technology as forces that have escaped human control and suggests we should align ourselves with their trajectories rather than trying to redirect them. But this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we believe we're not in control, we stop trying to exercise control, and then we really aren't in control. The systems run according to their internal logic, optimizing for growth and efficiency rather than for human values, because no one is steering toward human values. The alternative is to insist that technologies and economic systems are human creations that can be shaped by human choices. This doesn't mean we have unlimited control or that change is easy. Complex systems have emergent properties that no one intended. Path dependencies make some changes harder than others. Power is unevenly distributed, giving some actors far more influence than others. But within these constraints, choices remain. We can regulate or not regulate. We can invest in some technologies rather than others. We can organize economic activity around different principles. These choices matter. Accelerationism's lasting contribution may not be its political program, which remains vague and contested, but its provocation. It forces us to think about scale, about systemic change, about technology as a force that can't be wished away or ignored. It challenges comfortable assumptions about progress and asks difficult questions about whether our current trajectory is sustainable or desirable. It refuses easy nostalgia and demands engagement with the actual conditions of late capitalism and advanced technology. But as a political philosophy, accelerationism is incomplete at best and dangerous at worst. It's incomplete because it doesn't provide clear mechanisms for achieving its stated goals, whether those goals are left emancipation or right transcendence. It's dangerous because its emphasis on speed and intensity can justify enormous costs and risks without adequate attention to who bears those costs or whether the risks are worth taking. The worse before better logic is seductive, but historically has led to catastrophe more often than liberation. What comes after accelerationism? Maybe nothing comes after. Maybe these debates continue, evolving as technologies and conditions change. Maybe in 10 years, we'll be discussing post-accelerationism or meta-accelerationism or some new framework we can't imagine yet. Or maybe events will overtake philosophy entirely. Maybe artificial general intelligence will arrive and render these debates moot. Maybe climate collapse will force a reckoning that makes theoretical positions irrelevant. Maybe slow, grinding stagnation will continue, and no transformation, accelerated or otherwise, will occur. But for now, in this moment, accelerationism offers a lens for understanding some of the most important questions facing humanity. How should we relate to technologies that are reshaping what it means to be human? How do we balance risk and possibility when the stakes are existential? Who gets to decide what future we're building and how fast we get there? Can collective intelligence guide our trajectory? Or are we passengers on runaway systems beyond our control? These questions don't have easy answers. Accelerationism provides some possible answers, though they're contradictory and deeply contested. What it doesn't provide is certainty. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the value of accelerationism is not in its conclusions, but in its refusal to accept that the present is inevitable or that the future is predetermined. It insists that transformation is possible, for better or worse. It demands that we think seriously about the forces reshaping our world, rather than pretending we can ignore them or wish them away. The car is accelerating. The cliff may or may not be ahead. We can argue about whether to hit the gas or reach for the brake, but eventually, someone has to grab the wheel. The question is who and in which direction they'll steer. That's not a question philosophy alone can answer. It's a question of power, organization, and collective choice. It's the most important question of our time. And how we answer it will determine not just what kind of future we get, but whether we get a future at all.